Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to begin by hearing evidence from a member of the Red Cross who was involved in helping those affected by the fire. And after that, we're going to hear evidence from a representative of the Cabinet Office. Yes, Mr. Keating.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the panel. Could I call MS Spragg, please?
Thank you. Good morning, Ms. Spragg.
Good morning.
You're going to affirm, I think. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Well, the words are there on the screen. Would you read them out, please?
I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, sir. Well, good morning, Ms. Spragg. First of all, thank you very much for accommodating us by attending today and assisting the inquiry with its investigations. Just a few introductory matters. Firstly, if you have difficulty in understanding any of my questions, please do let me know and I'm sure I can rephrase them. Secondly, if I could invite you to keep your voice up, please, and amplify it as best you can, so our transcriber who sits to the right can capture what you say. And equally in that vein, if you could avoid nodding or shaking your head, because that's something which isn't picked up on a transcript. And finally, we will take a mid-morning break, but at any stage, if you do need a break, please do let us know. Is that okay?
Thank you, yes.
Turning to your evidence, first of all, by way of a couple of formalities and identifying the two witness statements you've made to the inquiry. Firstly, could we go to BRC, please? 6050. That's your first statement. We can see that's dated the 12th of June 2019. And we could turn to page 19 of that statement, please. We see your name in print and the date, and could you just confirm that's your signature?
Yes.
And turning to your second statement, please, that's BRC, I believe it's 6 zeros again, 81, please. Thank you very much. And that's dated the 20th of February 2020, and if we go to page 5 of that document, again, could you confirm that's your signature?
It is, yes.
And have you had the opportunity to read both those statements recently?
I have, yeah.
Thank you. And can you confirm that the contents of those statements are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms. Spragg, we've already heard from your colleague, Mr. Adamson, last week when he gave evidence, and I'm not going to trespass on the same areas. To assist you, I'm going to ask you a little bit about the role of British Red Cross in the London Resilience Framework, just a short part of your evidence. And then I'm going to focus upon your involvement involvement of British Red Cross in events on the 14th, 15th of June thereafter,
Okay.
if that assists you. So dealing first of all with your background and your position, briefly if I may. Professional background, Ms. Spragg, is it right that you've worked in the charity sector for over 19 years, going back to February 2003?
Yes.
And you've set out helpfully in your statement your employment history, which includes roles with the Help the Aged charity, and then is it the case that you then joined the British Red Cross in January 2015?
That's right, yes.
And since August 2016, you've held the position of Director for London Independent Living and Crisis Response. Is that correct?
That's true. The job title is slightly different now, but the role is the same, yes.
The job title might have changed, but is it right that you're still with British Red Cross?
Yes, that's true. The job title, just for clarity, is Director for Health and Local Crisis Response, but it's the same as the role was at that time.
Thank you. And as part of that role back in June 2017, is it correct that you were responsible for the London Emergency Response Team?
Yes.
And reading from your statement, I can summarise it at paragraph 21. You set out that there was a dual purpose for the London Emergency Response Team, which included providing help to people in an emergency situation, and secondly, to work with partner organisations on plans and preparedness. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true, yeah.
So two aspects. One, in terms of pre-emergency planning, and secondly, actual dealing with emergency response.
Yes. And that the pre-planning would be internally as well as with partners externally, yes.
You're just dropping your voice a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Apologies.
You try and keep it up as best you can. And at paragraph 29 of your statement, again, I can summarise it. You say that the work of the emergency response team during a response is perhaps understandably focused on supporting vulnerable people who are affected by matters that require emotional or practical support during or immediately after emergency.
Yes, that's right.
In relation to how the British Red Cross fits into the London Resilience Framework, let's just deal with that as a brief subheading. Is it right that British Red Cross is neither a Category 1 or Category 2 responder within the meaning of the Civil Contingencies Act?
Yes, that's right.
If we could go to your statement, please, your first statement at page 7, that's BRC 6050, paragraph 33, thank you. Perhaps we could just focus upon your role as chair of the Voluntary Sector Panel. So you say this: in my role at British Red Cross, I'm the chair of the Voluntary Sector Panel, which is part of the partnership. I've held this role since May 2017. The partnership is led by the London Resilience Forum, which sets out the strategy and work plan of the partnership and meets quarterly. You mentioned how the Voluntary Sector Panel operates alongside a number of other sector panels, which form part of the London Resilience Partnership and promotes collaboration across organisations. British Red Cross representatives form part of the Voluntary Sector Panel alongside representatives from, for example, First Aid, Nursing, Yeomanry, the St John's Ambulance, Victim Support, and other teams which are set out in that statement. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
How well, as of June 2017, did you consider the Voluntary Sector Panel fitted in to the London Resilience Framework?
I'd say that we were well connected into the framework. So as the chair of the panel, I had standing invites to all of the forum meetings and various other things that were happening as a result of that partnership. And we had, as a panel, opportunity to comment on various things that were coming out of the LRF. So an opportunity to be involved in training and exercising. So I think we were well connected, yes.
Okay. So your view was that, as chair of the Voluntary Sector Panel, is that the voluntary sector was well connected within that framework. I just want to move on to one matter you mentioned.
May I just clarify? I think the panel was well connected. It's very difficult to say the sector as a whole was well connected, but the panel, as it consisted of those a finite number of organisations, was well connected, yes.
As a chair, you were the conduit for the voluntary sector panel. Did you feel that you, at that stage, were connected to the wider voluntary sector?
It's really difficult to be connected to the wider sector. So no, that was the challenge that we always were aware of. The members of the panel are substantively organisations with a pan-London remit and one with emergency response in their remit. So by definition, that's not going to include all of the voluntary sector.
So that the membership and the organisation you would have most contact would be more formal, perhaps even national voluntary groups?
Yes, national with regional presence or London specific, yes.
I'm just going to move to paragraph 44, if I may. And we touched upon the role already of the British Red Cross. You mentioned in terms of emergency response, but also pre-emergency response in terms of planning and preparedness. And it says this: reference to British Red Cross and its role it can play are frequently included in emergency plans prepared by local authorities and also reference in LRF protocols and frameworks, including the Humanitarian Assistance Framework. Just focusing on this last matter, the British Red Cross is often involved in reviewing plans at a borough level via the London Emergency Response Team at local borough resilience forum and at pan-London level via the London Resilience Partnership. Just expanding upon that, so could you assist with how often would the British Red Cross be involved, perhaps at a borough resilience forum level?
So I have an emergency response team of 5 members of staff, and we were trying to engage with all of the BRFs, the Borough Resilience Forums across London. So obviously there's quite a large number of those. So our aim was and is to engage with all of the forums at least once a year, but then potentially more than that if we had the capacity. So often we would attend, the team, not myself, but the team would attend more than one a year.
Did you find that, as of June 2017, that the participation of different BRFs varied, in other words, whether they would take up your offer of assistance?
So the Red Cross was always invited to the BRFs. Assistance wouldn't necessarily be offered there, but my team would always tell me that we always were given opportunity to present what we could offer in terms of our capabilities. So that was something that was that was something that was happened at the BRFs. BRFs recognised the Red Cross role could play, I would say. Yeah.
So there's a representation at BRFs, and there was the opportunity to provide assistance or make contributions.
Yes. Yeah.
And turning to ORBKC for a moment, can you recall whether the British Red Cross had ever been invited to their Borough Resilience Forum prior to 2017?
I can't recall that personally. There may be records that show it. I would have expected that we would have had an invite before that time, yes.
Well, it's not a memory test. Let me help
No.
you in relation to that. So let's go to your second statement, please, which is BRC 6081. Thank you very much. And turn to paragraph 9, first of all. And paragraph 10, actually. So, thank you very much. Paragraph 10, where the question was at paragraph 10. Question 4, prior to 14 June, when was the last time a BRC representative attended the appropriate local authority panel Borough Resilience Forum? And you say this in your statement: I have no recollection or record of British Red Cross being invited to an ORBKC Borough Resilience Forum prior to 2017. In 2017, British Red Cross was invited to a BRF, British Borough Resilience Forum, scheduled for the 22nd of March 2017. However, our records show that this Borough Resilience Forum meeting was subsequently cancelled, and the next meeting we were invited to was scheduled for the 18th of July 2017, but our records show that this was then postponed. So drawing that together, it appears to be no record of an invitation, although in 2017 that there was an invitation, but that was postponed on 2 occasions.
Yeah, I agree with that, yes.
Would it follow from this that the British Red Cross didn't have any review or input into ORBKC's emergency plans?
It does suggest that, yes. I mean, there may have been communication through different routes, say for emails into the team, but that's not normally something that would happen. It would normally be discussion at the BRF. So yes, that does seem to be the case. Yeah.
So the BRF, from drawing together your evidence, seems to be the location where that sort of input would come from or stem from. Is that fair?
Yes. Yeah.
If we have your first statement, well, actually, I can just summarise. In your first statement, paragraph 41, you refer to the relationship in general terms with a local authority, and the British Red Cross would be governed by a memorandum of understanding. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire in June 2017, can you assist with whether there was a current memorandum of understanding between ORBKC and British Red Cross in place?
No, it doesn't seem as if there was a current one at that point.
Your evidence, as you set out in your statement at paragraph 41, is that you were unable to locate one. What memorandum of understanding you could locate was dated September 2016. Is that correct?
Yes, so it wouldn't have been in place at the time of the fire. Yeah.
Yes. Well, let's have a look at that document, if we may. Very briefly, it's at BRC, and it is 56055, please. Thank you. And we see a covering letter with the document. It's dated the 11th of January 2016, sent to your colleague Christina Dalton. Please find and close a signed copy of the Memorandum of Understanding. We're delighted to confirm our continued commitment to this service, and it confirms that there will be a donation of £2,000. Was that relatively standard in terms of the agreement between, or the understanding between British Red Cross and a local authority at that stage was that there would be a donation of that sum?
Yes, the memorandum was the same, and the donation amount was the same across all of the MOUs and the local authority arrangements, yes.
And was it unusual that, in terms of with an agreement with a local authority, that in this case it had lapsed and it had been out of date by 9 months? Was that unusual back in June 2017 with the relationships with local authorities?
I think it's fair to say that, yes, some had lapsed. They weren't, things were being renewed at different times. It wasn't a constant, everybody starts on one day and everybody finishes, every other MOU finishes on another. So it wasn't wholly unusual, but we did have memorandums of understanding in place with the majority of local authorities at the time of the fire. So I think that was just, potentially it was a bit of an admin issue that one wasn't renewed, but don't know for sure.
And did the absence of a signed current memorandum of understanding for June 2017, did that in any way affect the relationship between OBKC and British Red Cross?
Not in terms of the response, no, it didn't, no.
If we could turn to page 7 of this document, there's just a couple of features perhaps you could assist us with. Is it right that this is a standard document which would have been used at the time for all local authorities, or was it specific to British Red Cross?
It was standard.
Yes. In fact, if we could, page 7 of the Memorandum of Understanding, please, which is BRC 6055. Thank you. I think we're looking at the statements now. Thank you very much. We see service specifications. Preparedness is set out there at 4.1, and I'm going to focus on response, if I may, at 4.2. And this is what it says there in the standard MOU. A robust 24/7 on-call structure facilitates support to LAPs. Pausing there for a moment, we've heard a lot of LAPs. In this context, this is a local authority panel.
Yes, that's right.
In fact, local authority partner, is that correct?
Partner in this context,
yes.
sorry, yeah.
I.e. the local authority or BKC.
Yes.
And enables British Red Cross deployments. Secondly, provision of personnel at rest centres, humanitarian assistance centres, survivor reception centres, and family and friends reception centres. And if we could turn to overleaf, please, top of page 8 of this document as we look at it. Provision of practical and emotional support to people affected by an incident, including multilingual phrase books, registration forms and equipment, inflatable beds, blankets, hygiene packs, refreshment, and psychosocial care. I'm going to ask you just to keep in your mind that reference to registration forms. We're going to come back to that in a short while. And lastly, in relation to this document at page 9, please, under the third last bullet point. I think we see that, actually, it's in the middle of the page. It says, BRC personnel will work under the management of the local authority panel, local authority partner, but without the policies and procedures, but within the policies and procedures of British Red Cross. So I'll try and say that again. So BRC personnel will work under the management of the local authority partner, but within the policies and procedures of British Red Cross. Is that correct?
Yes.
So having that context, first question is this. In an emergency situation, who would have responsibility for setting up and operating a rest centre, if I could use a generic term?
A local authority.
Local authority.
Yeah.
Even if there is a memorandum of understanding that you would assist in relation to that?
Yes, our role as the Red Cross is there to support, but it's the local authority's responsibility in that area to set up the centre.
And in relation to registration, feature registration of those who attend a rest centre, again, I'm going to use a generic term, who would be responsible for that process as you understood it?
The same, local authority.
And what was your understanding of the process of registration in terms of an MOU? Let's say I'm a local authority, I'm new to the department. Explain to me how registration would work if British Red Cross were deployed.
So we would expect that when the team arrives, my Red Cross team arrives at a rest centre, they would be given various things to do, asked to perform various functions, and one of those might be registration. We could offer registration forms to be used, and then on the instruction of the authority to actually perform the registration, we would do that and capture information as people arrived at the centre.
The thrust of your evidence would be, on attendance, it would be at the direction of the local authority.
Yes.
And what would happen in a situation where there was nobody from the local authority there and the British Red Cross were first on the scene?
That's very difficult because it's not our role to register people. So it's not a role that we would take on without that instruction.
And in terms of registration as of June 2017, in the circumstances where the British Red Cross were asked or directed to take hold of the registration process, how would that take place? Would it be electronic? Would it be paper?
They were paper forms, and I believe at this particular incident we were asked to use the Red Cross forms, so they were paper triplicate forms.
So paper triplicate forms. So an attendee would come, they would meet somebody from British Red Cross, their details would be taken down by hand.
Yes.
In triplicate. Then what would happen to those forms?
The forms are the responsibility, because the data is the responsibility of the local authorities. So they would be collated and kept somewhere safe and then given over to the local authority at various intervals.
And British Red Cross would keep a copy as well?
We would sometimes, yes, we would sometimes keep a copy so that the data was secure in two places, if you like, but ultimately
Yes.
it's not our data to keep, and we would make arrangements to hand all copies over at a later point.
And were you aware of any process in which that paper information would ever be put into an electronic format?
In this particular incident,
Yes.
do you mean? I do recall that at some point later into the response and at the Westway Centre, there was a team run by local authorities that I think were inputting data into spreadsheets, but it's not something that we were part of. We were just handing the forms over.
So in essence, British Red Cross would be there to assist but not lead in relation to registration, and it was a manual process, noting details down on paper and providing a copy to the local authority.
Yes, that's right.
Thank you.
Can you just help me with this? You say you would take the information down on paper forms in triplicate. What was the purpose of having two additional copies, so to speak?
I'm not sure, to be honest, but I think the forms, having three copies of the same thing, just facilitated different people having them if that was needed. So certainly the focus of that information was for the local authority. There could have been in different incidents that those forms were used for different agencies.
Mm-hmm. But you wouldn't expect the Red Cross people to separate the forms out and distribute them to different recipients?
No, because it's the local authority's responsibility to do that.
Thank you.
I think we'll revisit registration briefly later on when we explore events on the 14th and 15th of June, which I'm just going to turn to now. Let's deal with the first topic, which is immediate deployment of the British Red Cross on the 14th of June. And with your assistance, as a document which you've provided, I'm going to turn to BORC, and it's 6 zeros again, 51. Thank you. It's called the British Red Cross Emergency Call Receipt. Effectively a log, is that correct, what this document is?
Yes.
And you've seen this before, and you've obviously provided it to the inquiry.
That's right,
as one of
yes.
your documents. And we could see at the top that the request time is 14th of June, 03:10. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And that's what was noted as the first time that the British Red Cross were notified of this incident. Isn't that correct?
That's right.
And the panel have heard evidence that David Curry was first informed by the duty laylow at 02:21 of the fire at Grenfell, just to put that into context. And this is a document you produced, but it's done by your colleague, John Putner, which we can see in the top left. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
And we see if you scroll down, community profile, numbers affected at this early stage, 200 persons is noted down. Correct?
Yes.
And then we see rest centre to be opened at Blue Sheets, Shepherd's Bush Green. If we turn, please, to page 4 of that document. Thank you very much. There's a number of entries there, and with your assistance, I'm just going to draw out a few points which will put a few matters into context. And we see at 0310, as we touched upon already, call received from David Curry, ORBKC, and that information and the request to set up a rest centre at Shepherd's Bush for residents. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And then in relation to that theme, in relation to Belushi's, we see that colleagues of yours were notified at 0315, at 0316. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And then, staying with Belushi's for a moment, the first official rest centre at 0345, we see those colleagues, Robin Wheeler and Ewan Williams, arrive at Belushi's, and the entry is nil persons presence, nil ORBKC. Correct?
Yes.
And if we go to 415, the next entry is in relation to this, it would appear, spoke to Robin Wheeler, still 0 persons in attendance, JB on scene. That must be Jean Borlott, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Then at 4:35, JP, who's the author of this log, on scene at Belushi's, 0 attendance. What does CL and Central EU arrive?
It's reference to vehicle. I think CL is another volunteer
Correct.
person, and the EU is a vehicle.
And at that stage, it states, decision made to redeploy one of your colleagues to Harrow Club to assist. Correct?
Yes.
And then if we go to the bottom of this page, we see at 5:30, checked in with Robin Wheeler, and still nobody at the rest centre, this being Belushi's, contacted Beck at ORBKC. Thank you very much, turning over leave, and advised nobody at the rest centre, suggests it's too far away, community reluctant to leave area, decision made by ORBKC to close the centre, and the British Red Cross team were directed to Harrow Club to assist. And the answer, the next entry is asked where ORC managers, that's rest centre managers,
I think so,
were,
yes.
but did not get an answer. So just dealing with that. So that's Belushi's, the first official rest centre. And is it normal in your experience in this area for an initial rest centre to be empty almost 2.5 hours after it being set up at 0310?
No, especially in the night like that, at the night time.
And the location of Belushi's in Shepherd's Bush was approximately 1 mile away. Again, for an initial rest centre in an urban area, in your experience, is that normal or good practice?
I would say it's not normal, no.
Perhaps common sense, you'd want somewhere in a safe location, but in proximity to the incident.
Yes, it's obviously important that people can get there easily. They know where it is and that people can get there as easily as possible. So it needs to be somewhere that's relatively close by, but as you say, somewhere safe.
Once we went following that theme through in relation to Belushi's, there was reference to the Harrow Club. So we're going to go back in time again and just follow through Harrow Club, and there's references to mutual aid. So if we could go back to page 4, please. And the first call was at 0310. At 0325, we have David Curry, so 15 minutes later, called to advise a second rest centre would be required. A scale of incident now larger, Harrow Club will be second rest centre. Is that correct?
Yes.
And again, very quickly, British Red Cross staff were notified to be deployed, and that's the reference to one of the vehicles, the EEU. Mm-hmm. We see that. Then we see at 3:40, Cara Treasure, UKO, was she the crisis response coordinator?
Yes, so Cara was in the Central Crisis Response Team. UKO is shorthand for UK Office. It tends to be shorthand for our central team.
Okay. And she was she advised or was she advising? It appears that she was advised large incident possible may require mutual aid.
Yes, so this will have been as part of our notification procedure with a large incident with statutory partners involved. The London ER team will inform the Central Crisis Response Team.
So bear in mind, a second rest centre was opened up. The amount of people involved within 30 minutes of notification, the view of British Red Cross was there was a flashing light here that we may need to draw in greater resources. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
And let's fast forward to 0455 in relation to this. Arrived at Harrow Centre, approximately 25 residents, no local authority, but TMO representative present. One of your colleagues left to encourage residents from Cordons to the rest centre. There's other matters there regarding Sky TV, MPS, Metropolitan Police assistance requested. Staff had started to make a list of who was present and provide refreshments, provided TMO with British Red Cross, rest centre forms to register residents, and then in capitals, full scale of incident becomes apparent, and that Cara Treasure updated mutual aid requested. A lot there, and we'll unpack that in a moment. But firstly, in relation to that theme of mutual aid, was at that state, was at the position then by 5 o'clock, it was clear to those at British Red Cross that the scale of the incident was so big that greater resources from across the country and outside London were required?
Yes, very much so.
And focusing again at that entry 455, it says at that stage there was no local authority at this second rest centre, but there was the TMO representative's presence. And in terms of the registration forms, they were provided to the TMO. Is that correct? That's what the entry suggests.
Yes, yes. And I think that will have been because the staff at the centre were trying to make lists, and I think the team there were trying to be helpful and give them some proper paperwork to do that on.
And you say at paragraph 59 of your statement, and I can read this out rather than jumping between documents, it says, during this time our teams were suggesting to staff at rest centres that individuals should be registered upon arrival using registration forms.
Yes, and we were doing that because, the team was doing that because there wasn't a local authority person to make that call. So we were making that suggestion on their behalf, I suppose.
And nobody from the local authority was there at that stage. They were trying to assist, as you say, in your evidence. And do you know what happened to those forms which were handed out at that stage?
I'm afraid I don't. No.
If we go to 5:30, please. Overleaf, thank you very much. And we've gone into second statement, so if we could go back to the log, thank you very much. Page 5 of the log, thank you. And we see there, probably need to scroll up a little bit so everybody could see. Top of the page. Thank you. We see the second column, 0530, SE arrived and a colleague directed to get people to come to the Harrow Centre. It became apparent that a spontaneous rest centre had opened at the Portobello Rugby Trust, a Rugby Portobello Trust. SE attended and assessed how many people were there, approximately 50. JP returned to Harrow Club. Metropolitan Police Service now present outside, and it states here 2 MPS DCs, perhaps detective constables, unclear, assisting with registration. Is that correct?
Yes, and I agree with your assumption about what the DC stands for there.
And we see at 0545, fed back above to the Beck and went to RPT. So it appears that the information that there was a spontaneous rest centre was identified here by the British Red Cross, and that was notified to the Beck because there was nobody from RBKC at the Harrow Club at that stage.
Yes, I believe that's right.
Contacted Beck again. Decision made by RBKC to move people from the Harrow Centre, Harrow Club, over to Rugby Portobello Trust to be in one place and easier to provide support. RBKC spoke to Rugby Portobello Trust management to agree this. At 0615, British Red Cross team now at the Rugby Portobello Trust. 0630, most residents now at the Rugby Portobello Trust. 0645, Harrow Club now empty. Signage in place directing residents to the Rugby Portobello Trust. And then it moves on to the third theme I just want to draw out, which is, and we've touched upon already, is staffing, or the lack of staff from RBKC. And we see again an entry here at 06:45 contacted Beck trying to locate ORBKC, LALO or rest centre staff. By this stage, a number of hours had passed. 03:10 was the first notification of the British Red Cross. We're 3.5 hours later, and there is no ORBKC staff which are identifiable to the British Red Cross at those rest centres. Again, from your experience, was that something that you would expect at that stage?
No.
Even at night time, would you giving every allowance, is that an acceptable period of time?
In my experience, I suppose the difference would be as well that you would usually have one clearer place for local authority and residents to go to, and that wasn't the case at this time. It was a much bigger incident than we'd been involved in before. But even then, if there was one place to go to, I would have thought really that the local authority would have representation there by that point, yes.
And specifically, we've heard evidence regarding rest centre managers, that being a specific role for a rest centre. Would you, from the British Red Cross perspective, expect, as part of your understanding with ORBKC, that they send down a rest centre manager down to the scene?
Yes, that's part of the model that we would expect, yes.
The evidence of David Curry in summary is as an expectation that it would be the British Red Cross which would provide everything. They would provide the rest centre manager and really operate the rest centre. Is that a fair expectation as of June 2017?
No, I would disagree with that. My team provide training on rest centre management to local authorities. And it's very clear that it's not our role to be the manager. We can support with that, but ultimately rest centres are the responsibility of the local authority.
So would it be the case if I was a local authority and decided that I wanted to outsource this specific role with British Red Cross and make my donation to you in the expectation that you would run the rest centre? Would that be a realistic expectation back in June 2017?
No, I think if specific requests had been made and specific arrangements for that had been put in place, then we could consider it. But as far as I'm aware, that hadn't happened. And rest centre management is provided by a local authority. And we support that, and I believe that's what's in the MOU.
Yes. And the MOU we looked at briefly, which you provide us, is, as you described, a standard MOU which would be used with other local authorities in London at that time.
Yes.
So just returning back to this seeking the location of ORBKC staff, we see at 08:15, which is at the bottom of this page, if you could scroll down, thank you so much, Chased Housing and Social Care, advised on way. It would be fair to infer from that entry that was your colleagues chasing ORBKC Housing and Social Care and advised by the BEC that they were on the way.
Yes, the communication from the team would largely be with the BEC, yes.
9:15 in similar terms, Chased Housing and Social Care, advised on way. That's at the bottom of the page. And then if we turn over to page 6, please, and the final entry in relation to this. 10:30, Chased Housing and Social Care, advised on way. So we see an entry here 5 hours and 20 minutes after British Red Cross were first notified of the incident being some hours before then, but still nobody from ORBKC at the rest centre as the British Red Cross were at. Is that correct?
Nobody from Housing and Social Care, and I suspect nobody from the council. That's what the records have shown me, yes. And
you're obviously your position at the state was oversight by your role, but are you able to say what sort of impact that would have on the operation of the British Red Cross in that sort of situation when there is a long period of time where there's an absence of the local authority?
Because the local authority is the lead for a centre and for centre management, they provide ultimately the coordination for what happens at that place. So for my teams, and it was very difficult to know who was in charge, and therefore the sorts of things that were needed, the various elements that were already there or that were going to be brought into the centre, so that our teams could then direct people who were arriving at the centre to the right support. So it was just a very uncoordinated picture, and that's the impact that it had for us. We were then the team would find it difficult to know what information was right or where to send people for further help. So it had an impact on us, but ultimately it was the impact on the residents that was the greatest.
And we could go to your statement, please, your first statement. That's paragraph 59. That's BRC 6050. Thank you. Paragraph 16. Did I say 59? Forgive me if I said 59. Thank you. And this is, we've touched upon and seen from the log, but when the British Red Cross volunteers arrived at the scene of the Grenfell fire, they found that there were several separate rest centres which had spontaneously been set up in local buildings, including mosques and churches. A location for an official rest centre had not been confirmed by RBKC. Pausing there for a moment, perhaps to clarify, we've heard about Belushi's and we've heard about the Harrow Club, and we've heard about the movement over to the Rugby Portobello Trust. Was that not an identification of the official rest centre?
I suppose looking back at the call log, there was a suggestion that there was an official rest centre, but it was apparent, and through the reports that we were getting, that I was getting through the morning, that there was confusion and there were several centres, so therefore which one actually was the official one.
And I'll continue from your statement. As a result, it was very difficult for the British Red Cross to identify which rest centre to support. Therefore, efforts were made to distribute our resources across all of the rest centre locations we were aware of in the interim. And during this time, our teams were suggesting to staff, as we said already, at rest centres that individuals should be registered upon arrival using registration forms. And it was at the position that the British Red Cross were spread, probably thinly at this stage, amongst the rest centres they were aware of on the morning of the 14th of June.
Yes.
And do you recall how many staff you had there? I mean, presumably the numbers built up over the course of some hours, but...
It's very difficult for me to say, I'm afraid I don't recall that. But yes, people were coming out as a result of additional calls that the duty team were making. And yes, it was very difficult. It did grow quite quickly over the course of that morning and that day.
I mean, we're thinking in terms of tens, 20?
If I was to guess, I would say it's difficult to get, but tens, probably no more than 20 in the early stages.
Yes. All right. Thank you.
Let's move on to the Westway. And we got your statement in front of us, paragraph 60. And we're just going to deal with, as you referred there to reference to the Westway, that there was a number of rest centres, and in the middle of that document, that included the Westway Sports and Fitness Centre, the Westway. And in terms of your attendance at SCG's, Strategic Coordination Group meetings, it's right that you attended a meeting at 8:30 through your role as chair of the voluntary sector panel, is that correct?
Yes.
And you also attended thereafter the 2 o'clock SCG meeting as well?
2:30, I think. Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yes. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask to refer to your notes for that meeting, please, which is BRC 6046. I say notes, it's an email which you created and sent. It's your name at the top, 1450, and it's sent to your colleagues at the Red Cross. It says re-SCG update. And we're going to focus really upon knowledge of rest centres. That's the theme we're examining. If we can scroll down, please. Under LA, local authority, we can see that there is highlighting and there's red text. That's how the document was provided. That's not done by us. It's provided by you in that way. And as a result of this meeting, it appears that this is what your notes are. New rest centre at Westway Sports Centre and Clement James Centre. Brackets, do we know of this one? have confirmed with Beck the wonders at the 3 Below and the Latimer Christian Centre. We are doing this. Clement James Centre is the same as St. Clement's Church. In relation to, do we know of this one? Was that in reference to the Westway or the Clement James Centre?
From recollection, I think it was the Clement James Centre at that point, yeah.
And then if we look at the last entry in that paragraph, local authority management support now solved at the centres, question mark in brackets. You're the author of this. Is there any significance to the fact that that's in a question mark?
So this was an email that I was writing whilst the call was ongoing as a way of capturing that discussion and sharing it quite dynamically with my team and colleagues. So I think that's reference to a report that was made on the SCG call to say that management support is now solved, and the question mark is mine to check with the team, is that true from our experience?
So an internal query by you to follow up and check that.
Yes.
And it says what the official rest centres are: Rugby Portobello Trust, Clement James Centre, Westway, and there's between 100 to 200 each. Respite centres, again, just help us with that terminology. It's not one within the London Resilience Framework, is it?
No, it isn't. So again, I think that is probably a term that was potentially used on the SCG call as in places that are providing respite, and I've summarised it like that.
Yes, it's not a criticism of you, it's just a clarification of the terminology.
Yeah.
It says set up sporadically, churches, council trying to get information to those to direct people for support to one of the 3 main centres. Is it the position by, as of this 2 o'clock SEG, that there still was a lack of clarity as to the rest centres, what was official, and where people should go?
Yes, I mean, the centres were defined as those 3 on the SCG call, so I suppose they can be defined as official, but the challenge was communicating that and the obvious confusion that was existing with all those people at all the different places. So it was a confusing picture.
And we know from your statement that at the next SCG meeting at 19:30 that evening, you received confirmation that the Westway had been established as the official rest centre with the view that there was going to be consolidation. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you set out at paragraph 61 of your statement, which perhaps I could summarise, that once the Westway had been established as the official rest centre, that's where the British Red Cross coordinated its efforts from the evening of the 14th of June. And you state this included helping with registration, helping people to find necessities, clothing, bedding, food and other items, and to settle down for the night. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
So just exploring the helping with registration at the Westway from the evening of the 14th of June. And we've heard evidence of wristbands being used. Is that something that is standard practice by the British Red Cross at rest centres?
I don't remember the teams having worked with wristbands before, but that doesn't say it had never happened. But again, it's not something that we would instigate. We would do that if the local authority or the organisation who was running the rest centre wanted that to happen. It's not something that we would make the decision on.
So you indicated it wasn't something that you remember being done before. Is that correct?
Yes, I don't remember that, but it doesn't mean that it hasn't happened before. I think potentially the incident of this size meant that it was something different, but I couldn't be sure on that.
And in the sort of hours and days which followed, were you aware of any negative feedback in relation to the utilisation of wristbands by the British Red Cross at the Westway?
Not specifically in terms of wristbands. I know there was frustration about accessing the centre, but I don't recall anything particular about wristbands. I could be wrong with that.
Well, we'll touch upon access in a moment. Well, let's deal with accessibility now. And your awareness of any concerns regarding accessibility. Did you become aware of any concerns regarding people accessing the Westway? Well,
there were the general concerns about, did people know that the Westway was a place to go. So was the communication clear on that? And from our experience at the Red Cross of supporting people in incidents, we know that not everybody would access an official centre that's run by authorities. So that was something that we were conscious could be an issue. I think they were the main things, I would say.
One of your colleagues, Colin Brown, refers to the cordon which formed, the police cordon which formed a perimeter around the Westway. Was that something that was raised with you as an issue, that the cordon was having an adverse impact on accessibility?
Yes, I do remember the team raising that with me, more from the perception, how it would feel for people arriving at the centre. It would feel like a blocker rather than something that was enabling them to access it.
And do you know what steps were taken to try to improve accessibility in those early days of the response to the Westway?
It's difficult for me to think of anything specific, but I know there was a lot of work going on to try and advertise the Westway as a place to go to, and for the police presence to be perhaps a little dialed back. I remember that's something that we were advocating for as an organisation.
We'll touch upon communication, a theme you mentioned, and advertisement, for want of a better word, of the Westway, and support, which is available in a short moment. In relation to the operation of the Westway, perhaps we could have a look at your statement again, please, your first statement at page 19, please. These are your sort of concluding remarks. It's a significant statement in terms of length. Page 19, paragraph C, paragraph 78C. You say this: there also appeared to be a lack of leadership and coordination in the efforts in the first few days. Reports from my team on the ground in the first day after the fire reflect that it was difficult to identify RBKC personnel, so people did not know who was in charge or who to ask for help. Is that correct?
Yes.
And was that an issue regarding identification and lack of leadership which existed only the first day, or did it persist for longer than that?
As I recall, it did go on for longer than just the first day. It was an issue of physical identification. So normally we would expect local authority staff to be wearing tabards, for example, something that made them clearly identifiable. So it made it difficult for my team to know who to go and speak to, but also then people who were attending. I can't remember exactly when that changed, but it was an issue that my team told me about for the first few days.
Yes, first few days. And in terms of source of information, you were perhaps the top of an apex from a strategic point of view, getting reports fed back from your colleagues. But is it right that you also attended the Westway?
I did, yes.
Yes. And did you attend the Westway, is it right, on the Thursday?
I believe it was on the Thursday, yes.
And what was your impression of the Westway on the Thursday when you attended?
I mean, I just remember going, firstly, the surrounding area was extremely busy, lots of people moving around, lots of food stalls, things, boxes being moved around, people standing in the streets not really knowing what to do. On the way into the Westway Centre itself was where you started to see the donations being piled up. I do remember police presence. And then I was able to access the centre with the Red Cross ID that I have. And again, that was extremely busy. It felt a little bit, disorganised. I think by the second day, it's when I was there, I should say, it felt like things were starting to be a bit organised in terms of there were zones in which the centre was being used. So donations were starting to be gathered in one particular place inside. There was obviously the place where people were able to sleep in another part. So I could see a sort of a pattern emerging, but it did feel still quite disorganised and people able to sort of move around quite freely within the whole space, as I remember.
Your colleague Colin Brown, was he also down there on the Thursday?
Possibly, I can't remember, to be honest. I went there on my own.
It's a long time ago and I'm putting you on the spot, but Colin Brown, is that he the UK Director of Independent Living and Crisis Response?
He was at that time. He was my boss at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, let's have a look at his statement, which might, there's a number of British Red Cross statements, and perhaps this might help enhance the picture. BRC 70s, please. 5. Thank you very much. We could turn to paragraph 64 of his statement. 64 says that he personally attended the scene on the morning of the 15th of June, and then we can go to paragraph 75, so we can see 75 in context. I would describe the manner in which the Westway was being operated as chaotic. I saw no visible leadership from anyone at a senior level within the ORBKC, and it was clear the ORBKC was, even with support from the voluntary organisations such as the BRC, becoming overwhelmed by the task of running the Westway and the outpouring of voluntary public support in the form of donations. Pausing there. That's his opinion. You were there on the Thursday and you had information which was fed back. Would you agree with that opinion?
I would, yeah.
Whilst we have his statement open, and he gives a specific example at paragraph 78, that he had, by this stage, he had returned home. Paragraph 77, he says, I was home but acting as the crisis response team duty manager. So he was on call because of the exceptional time. He wouldn't normally do that, but he was stepping in. He says this, at around 10 p.m. I received a phone call from the BRC duty officer who was out on site at the Westway, leading the BRC bronze effort on the ground. The duty officer informed me that the BRC volunteers had been unable to identify anyone from the ORBKC who was seemingly in charge of running the rest centre, although there was a number of more junior ORBK members of staff on site. And that's what he raises as something which has been escalated to him on the Thursday evening. Was that something that you had knowledge of even then, on the second day, on the evening, that there was a lack of senior ORBKC staff at the Westway?
Yes, in the role that I had, I would have had those things escalated to me as well.
Perhaps just whilst we have his statement open, can we go to paragraph 101, please? And it's the last matter I'm going to mention in relation to registration. And it's something which we've touched upon a couple of times already, but just out of completeness, because we've asked you a number of questions regarding registration. And you were asked the question, well, what happens to the forms when they're completed? You say they're given to the process that would be given to the local authority. And this is what Colin Brown, your boss at the time, says. However, I got the sense that ORBKC was not discharging this responsibility in relation to registration. I came to the view because the BRC volunteer found a box containing a number of the second and third copies of the registration forms that had been filled in by the BRC and provided. The ORBKC left lying around the Westway. It appeared that no efforts had been made by the ORBKC to collate the data in any sensible manner. And he asked the bronze on-site duty officer to report the presence of this box to ORBKC, to express concern and dissatisfaction as to the state of affairs, and to ask for clarification as to how the data was being appropriately collated. You're the first live British Red Cross witness we've asked specifically about this. Were you aware of this issue?
It would have been escalated to me at the time. I can't recall it specifically. But
Can you recall now what the outcome of that escalation was with ORBKC?
I can't, I'm afraid. No.
Bear in mind the matters regarding registration, and British Red Cross would be doing it on behalf of the local authority. Would this be a matter of concern to you on the second day that registration forms were left lying around?
Yes, absolutely.
I'm going to move on to a new topic, please, which is the provision of support at the Westway. You mentioned that's where the British Red Cross focused its support in those days. In terms of, if we could look at your statement of paragraph 71, BRC 6050. briefly touch upon psychological support, And it says this, that British Red Cross staff and volunteers are all given basic training in providing emotional help. You refer to your colleagues who coordinate and make specialist psychosocial support services in an emergency situation. In the days immediately after fire, we made sure that British Red Cross personnel trained in providing more specialist psychosocial support, known as the Psychosocial Team, or PST, were at the Westway. And then it goes on, we've offered to support other services in this regard and teamed up with the NHS outreach teams to increase their capacity to reach people affected who are in hotels and other locations. So that provides an umbrella of the support which was provided. Is it right that that wider support, that outreach support, took some days to implement?
Yes, it will have done. I can't remember exactly when it came into play, but it will have taken some time, yes.
Yes. Perhaps we can see that from other records and we don't need to focus too much upon it, but it wasn't the case that people were going, from the British Red Cross, were going to hotels in the first few days of the response, is that correct?
Not immediately, because we didn't have the information as to where people were staying.
Yes. And in relation to information about where people were staying, was that an issue that was causing you concern, that there wasn't that available to you?
Yes. So it wouldn't always be the case that we at the Red Cross would be given that information, but what it indicated was that there is a bigger issue, that there was not a complete list of people affected and where they were, because that then impacted on the support that we or anybody else could give to them.
If we move down to the next page, paragraph 74, where you address catering for the needs of specific groups of people, and you provide this opinion. In the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell fire, I believe that there was insufficient regard given by the authority to catering to particular needs. Survivors turned to local churches and mosques for support. British Red Cross teams reported that in the Westway Rest Centre there was very little private space, including, for example, for use by women or people of faith or areas where people could break their Ramadan fast together. And we pushed for items such as screens to provide some privacy to survivors who were staying at the Westway Rest Centre. We also arranged for furniture and furnishings to try and improve the surroundings. Was that the position, that there was concerns identified by British Red Cross, and as a result you pushed for changes to address those?
Yes.
And are you able to assist now how long it took for those changes to be implemented?
I can't remember exactly. People were staying at the rest centre for a few nights, and I know that the the conditions on the first night weren't as we would have wanted them to be.
Is that normal? It's first nights. It's an emergency situation. It takes some time to bring matters together. When would you expect a rest centre which is accommodating people overnight to be at a suitable standard, an acceptable standard?
It's really important to remember the scale of this. There were literally hundreds of beds that we'd helped to lay out within that space to make it into a rest centre. It's very difficult to make a space that size comfortable. The centre that had been identified was big enough in a way, but it didn't have the facilities to make it comfortable and to create different private spaces. So whilst that potentially could have been thought about in advance, if the numbers had been smaller for that rest centre, the space could have been used differently. So this is really difficult. I think ideally we would advocate for everybody's needs to be considered as early as possible. But acknowledging that with a scale of something like this, it could be difficult to get it within the first night, but that would be our hope, that people would have some privacy at least.
Can I just ask you say that you push for items such as screens and later that you arrange for furnishings. Who were you in contact with to do that?
So that would have been the team on the ground via the BEC, the Borough Command Centre, who would then be liaising with the local authority to try and access things. But then also our arrangements, we have corporate partners at the Red Cross who are offering things like furniture and furnishings, and we were able to tap into that at a slightly later date.
And we've seen some photographs of the rest centre at Westway some days after the fire, and we saw that there were armchairs and sofas and so on. Is that the furnishing you provided, or did that come from somewhere else?
It could have been. There was a mixture of providers by sort of a few days in, but we certainly had some partners who were providing things, yeah.
Yes, thank you.
ORBKC were responsible as a local authority up until at least Friday, the 16th of June at 2 o'clock. At that stage, London Local Authority Gold were responsible for the response. Mm-hmm. Then we heard about the Grenfell Fire Response Team, which Mr. Addison has assisted us with, which was set up over that weekend. Using that as a marker, Friday, 2 or 3 days after the incident, are you able to say, in your view, when the Westway, or if the Westway improved?
I'd say it was a gradual improvement over several days, actually. So it's difficult to pinpoint a particular day.
Well, let's discuss the purpose of the Westway. Were there issues regarding the understanding and promotion of what type of centre the Westway was?
Yes, and who it was for, so yes.
Let's look at an email to assist you in relation to that, which you sent, RBK 000 38595. Thank you. I'm just going to focus on the 1819 or 619, so just in the middle we see the British Red Cross and an email that you sent on the Friday, 6:19 p.m. to Tony Andrews and Sue Redmond. And the subject is issue, comms, immediate temporary community assistance centre for the weekend. And it says this: Hi Tony, Sue, regarding promotion of the centre and your point below, centre manager who liaises with police running the Friends and Family Centre at Westway to ensure the above staff can support users of the FFRC as well as the users of the CAC. We are picking up some issues in terms of how the Westway has been promoted and what is happening on the ground. And it gives a link there, and it says that the Westway Sports Centre is now the Family and Friends reception and has been staffed by the police. You've copied into the text that appears here that the second part, there's a special centre at the Salvation Army, and the Salvation Army is open until 11 p.m. So you're raising an issue regarding how the Westway is being promoted, and you're giving two examples which are in the body of this email.
Yes.
And it states, your text then, friends and family are not always being allowed in, as people at the Westway believe it to be a rest centre for displaced residents, brackets, CAC, meaning Community Assistance Centre, and that the friends and family, F&F, are to go to the Salvation Army. We have some anger directed towards volunteers on the reception, registration desk. Can we please make sure comms is joined up and that information flow clearly to make sure everyone in distress who comes to the centre is able to access the support they need? So there's a lot in there, but you've raised the concern regarding how the Westway is being presented at that stage and how it seems to be presented not as a community assistance centre, but on this information it's been presented as a family and friends reception centre alone. And then it refers to a special centre at the Salvation Army we've just seen. Does it follow that as of Friday afternoon, 16th of June, that people who were seeking information were being wrongly turned away or refused entry to the Westway? Was that the concern you were raising?
Yes, it does. That is the concern I'm raising there, where I describe that people weren't always being allowed in. And I think this was an example of the time where perhaps the Westway the official function was starting to transition, but the communication around that wasn't joined up. The text in black there, where I refer to somebody else's email, centre manager to liaise with police running the Friends and Family Centre, that wasn't the way that it was being described to us on the ground. So I think that just indicates that there was confusion about the definition and therefore who could access it.
Because looking at those two texts, two different references, if an individual was looking for information, they were being directed to two different locations, one at the West Ware, one at the Salvation Army. Is that a fair summary?
That was where people would be directed through the official communication, yes.
And to assist you, we've got a number of sources of information, one from the Salvation Army, Adrian Clee in his statement, CVF 6059, page 4 of his statement. And his evidence is that the Salvation Army, which ran the Friends and Family Reception Centre, that closed at latest partway through Thursday the 15th of June. We've evidence from the Metropolitan Police that says that Friends and Family Reception Centre was moved to the Westway by the evening of the 14th of June. On any basis, on the evening of the 16th of June, the Salvation Army was not where the Friends and Family Reception Centre was.
Okay.
So drawing that together is that there was still information where people had been sent to the wrong place. Is that correct?
Yes, that's how it seems, yes.
And that's the reason why you raised this issue regarding communications and clarity of communications.
Exactly, yeah.
I'm going to move on to multi-agency information sharing, which in essence is going to deal with SCG meetings very briefly and humanitarian assistance steering group meetings as well.
Okay.
We've touched upon already, because of your role as the voluntary sector chair, that you attended those meetings, those SCG meetings. And is it fair to say that they're an important tool in information sharing between different agencies during emergency response?
Yes.
It follows from that very important in building a sort of global situational awareness.
Yes, that's right.
And from your experience, is it right that you've been on multiple SCGs in the past?
Yes, that's true. I have.
We've had sight of the minutes, and I'm not going to invite you to look at the minutes now, some years later, but did you have any general observations as to how the SCGs operated on the 14th and 15th of June in fulfilling that objective of sharing information and building situational awareness?
I don't recall anything that was particularly different, so I remember them being organised, well chaired, an opportunity for all of the partners to feed in their information. So as far as I can remember, they fulfilled the purpose of building that situational update, and they followed the same structure and agenda as I've been used to before.
And was it a theme from your recollection of those meetings, the desire for greater clarity as to the numbers and identity of people who've been affected by the fire?
Yes, I think that was a theme through the first day of those meetings, certainly, yes.
Just going to move on to the Humanitarian Assistance Steering Group. And again, that was another specific but important forum for information sharing, isn't that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And you outline in your statement at paragraph 62, we don't need to turn to it, but the main purpose of that steering group is to oversee and coordinate the support provided in response to the needs of people affected by the Grenfell fire and lead towards recovery.
Yes.
Is that a fair summary?
Yes.
And we know that the first meeting was held on Thursday, the 15th of June at 2 o'clock. In relation to that, from your experience of being on these meetings in the past, would you have expected a steering group meeting to have taken place before 2 o'clock on the second day of an incident?
There isn't a particular timing specified for HASG, as far as I'm aware. I think for something this scale, I wasn't too surprised that it was happening the next day because the situational awareness was still building.
Yes. And you say correctly that there isn't any particular time specified. Is it right that you're referring to the London Resilience Documents, the Humanitarian Assistance Framework?
That's right, yes.
And to assist everybody, at paragraph 4.17, it says that HSSGs are expected to meet frequently in the immediate aftermath of an incident, but less often in later stages. In the initial stages, meetings should be at least daily. But it doesn't say in the guidance that it should be held within the first 12 hours or 18 hours or 24 hours. It's not prescriptive in that sense. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
And in relation to that first meeting on the 15th of June at 2 o'clock, it's right that you attended that meeting?
I did, yeah.
Yes. And let's turn to paragraph 63 of your statement, please, in relation to that. We see at the bottom of the page, the meeting took place. It was attended by several members of RBKC, plus representatives from the NHS and Crew's Bereavement Care and Victim Support, amongst others. Sue Redmond, who we've heard evidence from, chaired the meeting. The main purpose was to identify immediate and urgent needs and establish a structure for meeting those needs. This is the part I'm inviting you to focus upon. My impression of this meeting was that it could be perhaps have been better organised, although I understand the extremely stressful and distressing situation everyone was involved in, especially the council staff. We can move down to paragraph 65. There was a discussion about the provision of support and the roles different organisations at the site were performing in an attempt to identify gaps in the services being provided. Topics raised include numbers of households affected, accommodation, welfare needs. At this stage, there was still no confirmation of numbers affected, nor confirmation of where all the survivors were located, whether in temporary accommodation or rest centres. And that last part, was that a matter of concern that there was still no confirmation of numbers affected or where survivors were located?
Yes, because it meant that without knowing how many and where people were, it was difficult to know what support was needed and where it was needed.
And was anything done in that meeting or suggested by you to address that lack of detail as to the numbers of people affected and their location?
I don't recall. I don't think I would have said anything particularly about that because it's just an issue that everybody was aware of, and we would be responding once that detail was available. We would be able to do something with it, but I don't think it's something that I would particularly have been able to contribute to.
Mr. Chairman, we don't have a huge amount left, but we will go past the mid-morning break. It may be a natural break now.
Yes, all right. Well, we can stop at that point. Thank you. Ms. Spragg, we have a break during the morning, as I think you were told, and this looks as though it's a good time to take it. So we'll stop there. We'll resume, please, at 25 to 12. And I have to ask you, while you're out of the room, not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
I understand, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you. 25 to 12, please. Would you ask the Spragg to come back in, please? Okay. All right, Ms. Spragg, ready to carry on?
Thank you, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes,
Sir.
Mr. Keating.
Well, welcome back, Mrs. Spragg. Just the last few questions. We're dealing with the Humanitarian Assistance Steering Group, or the HASG. How would you pronounce that acronym?
HASG, HASG is the alternative we use sometimes.
So I'm going to ask you about the HASG then. You already have adduced by your statement your impressions of that initial meeting on the 15th of June. But I wanted to turn to a document which if we just have in front of us now, which you provided. If we look at the second page, please. And we see there that it's a Humanitarian Assistance Steering Group Impact Assessment. We know from the records and your evidence and your two statements is that this was prepared in advance of the meeting on the 15th of June, and then it was updated as a result of the meeting. So quite a current document prepared on the 14th and then updated on the 15th of June. And in relation to what a humanitarian assistance impact assessment is, perhaps the first paragraph assists. Emergencies affect communities in a wide variety of ways. To understand what humanitarian assistance is required, one first needs to map out who is affected and how the emergency has affected them. Is that correct?
Yes.
And we see in the third paragraph, to understand how emergencies affect individuals and their communities and thus prioritise and scope the humanitarian assistance effort, it's important to understand how emergencies impact upon the environment they live and work in. And with that sort of background for an impact assessment, we can turn to the next page. Page 3, please. We can see it's 21-27. 14th of June, then updated post this meeting on the 16th of June. What I'm going to ask you to do is, we can see at the bottom of that page, recommendations. So these are recommendations which you prepared in this document and fed into the steering group. We could turn to the next page, page 4. So this document set out the views of the British Red Cross as what needed to be done to meet the needs of those affected. Number 1, engage community to identify what support they feel they need and would be helpful. Is that correct?
Yes.
Establishment of HAC or similar, a humanitarian assistance centre. And what would the benefit of having a HAC? What would that serve?
The function of a centre like that is to bring together a wider variety of support that's available for people who attend the centre. So it's about a broader engagement and meeting needs in a wider way.
Support line, providing emotional support, practical support, and signposting. Signposting people to support available, is that correct?
Yes.
And we'll return to that in a moment. Support to injured and bereaved families and friends. And I'm just going to deal with the last matter, management of information and signposting to those displaced, particularly over the next 48 hours. And in relation to that matter, the fact that it was emphasised, particularly over the next 48 hours, was there an identified need to manage information and signpost that support to those displaced in the short term?
I think at the time that this was put together, was the time when it was quite confused about what support was available where and where people should go, and also where people had been moved to or where people were resting and staying. So I think that was reflecting of that time, and that's why we were emphasising particularly over 48 hours, as in it needs to be done as quickly as possible.
So those are the key matters in your mind and the British Red Cross's mind that needed to be addressed at that early stage as of the evening of the 14th of June.
Yes, but I think this one was the version that was updated on the 16th
Okay.
as well. So
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like you to turn to another email, please, which is RBK 000-22720. And we look at the middle of page 1, please. And we see an email from Sue Redmond, which we've seen once before. Sue Redmond, and you are copied in. If you could scroll down, thank you very much. Sue Redmond, 20 to June, 22:34. You're copied in. And it's Sue Redmond to Carolyn Downs. And it says this: Carolyn, the community engagement has been missing from everything, and we've been saying that from the start. And yes, everything in the support strand has got to be about what the community want and recognising what the community are already doing. And then overleaf at the next page, please, page 2. It says this: not a criticism, just a plea. I've CC'd in Emma from Red Cross, so we had this conversation a lot. This is the 20th of June, so almost a week after the incident. We know by this stage that the Grenfell Fire Response Team, London Gold, had now taken over the response. And Sue Redmond was still involved. And her comment there that community engagement has been missing from everything, and we've been saying this from the start. Had you conversations with her, as this email suggests you did?
I do remember talking with Sue, not specifically, but I do, particularly at the response team in Victoria, yeah.
And what was there concerns expressed in your discussions regarding the lack of community engagement?
Yes, yes.
And can you recall now what that issue was? We're talking in very global terms. Can you give any more details as to what was lacking?
I think it was. It's very difficult to recall specifics from that time, but in my role as part of the humanitarian assistance group, I was, on behalf of the Red Cross and voluntary sector, I guess, trying to put forward the points that to provide the right sort of support means you need to understand better the people who need the support, and hopefully ideally have that shaped by the people and by the community, because that makes the support as appropriate as possible and right for them as individuals and as a community. And by that time, as I remember and looking at these emails, the structures weren't there to do that properly.
What sort of structure would you need for that to take place?
As an example, from my perspective at the Red Cross, and one thing we've learned from this is to put roles in place that specifically focus on community engagement, for example. But that would need to be part of a bigger structure, bigger infrastructure, with representatives from the local authority and others potentially getting involved, because it's all about building a shared picture. So I think really it's about roles that focus specifically on community engagement and having that as a channel to feed into the humanitarian assistance group.
And those roles and that structure, would that be something which should be pre-existing rather than being set up post-incident?
Ideally, I suppose, in my experience, and what I would hope would be that, yes, there would be already existing connections with communities, an understanding of communities and their likely needs in an emergency situation, where they may go, what sort of places might open their doors. It's all part of that. So yes, ideally, at least some of that information would be in place before.
Yes. Final topic is public communication, and perhaps we could open up your statement, please, at paragraph 78A, please. That's BRC 6050. And we're going to look at some of your closing remarks in your first statement in a moment. Thank you. You said it's clear accessible information should have been provided to survivors earlier, including on where to go for help. That's something you've told us this morning. Quote, there was a delay in providing information and this heightens the difficulties for the survivors in their ability to obtain the emotional and practical support they needed. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what we're going to do is we're just going to explore the other changes in terms of the avenues as to communication. One is the support line, and then we'll touch upon leaflets and newsletters very briefly. And to assist your recollection, I'm going to touch upon some of the documentation you provided by British Red Cross. So the last of two items is the telephone support line, and we can take this relatively quickly. Touched upon in your statement and in documents we've seen already before the panel. Is it correct that one of the areas the British Red Cross was involved in providing information to those affected was through a support line?
Yes.
And again, is it right from an early stage on the 14th of June, you suggested opening the British Red Cross telephone support line?
I did, yes.
And that was a suggestion you made at an SCG level, at a Strategic Coordinating Group level.
That's right, yes.
And we know that a British Red Cross support line had already been opened in relation to the Manchester Arena incident, which had taken place on the 22nd of May, a few weeks before this incident in North Kensington. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
And again, it's right, and we've seen in documentation to support this, that you raised at the Humanitarian Assistance Steering Group meeting on the 15th of June, again using the telephone support line.
Yes.
And after that meeting, is it right that you received confirmation that the British Red Cross should use the helpline to assist Grenfell survivors?
It is right, but I'm not. It wasn't immediately following that meeting. I think following that meeting is potentially a few days later than that.
Well, from records, it appears that it was operational from the 16th of June, Friday the 16th of June. Does that sound about right?
Yes, it could be if that's what the records show, yes.
Well, let's have a look at it to assist you. It's BRC 6087, and this is a BRC operational update. And if we could go to update 9, which is at the bottom of page 25. Again, documents you've helpfully provided the inquiry. And these update overviews, is it right that this is a sort of process that British Red Cross circulate to key members, an operational update overview, sometimes on a daily basis, if not more than that?
Yes, so this is something that the Central Crisis Response Team pulled together based on all the different information that's coming together. So yes, that's right.
And it says there under the date, operational update, the 17th of June, which is the Saturday. Please find updated information in red. And we can go to the bottom of the page. We see under support line, right at the bottom, in red, 13 calls relating to Grenfell yesterday, 4 further calls today. BRC will be the only agency operating a support line for Grenfell Tower fire. Piecing it together, if there was calls yesterday to the line, support line, that means it was operational on Friday, the 16th of June. Does that sound about right?
It must have been. I mean, I honestly can't remember exactly when the agreement was made for it to be the only telephone line. But given that it was already operational, it wouldn't surprise me that people were starting to ring a Red Cross support line relating to the Grenfell fire, as well as the other incidents that it was there for.
Was there any reluctance that you sensed or was expressed to you about using the British Red Cross support line?
Reluctance from who, sorry?
Reluctance from the local authority in accepting that offer.
I don't know if it was reluctance, but there was a delay in accepting the offer, yes.
And was there any reason why there was expressed to you that there was a delay in accepting the offer?
I don't remember a specific reason. I know that the local authority had other telephone lines that were available, but I don't know whether that was the reason they didn't accept our offer.
We've seen reference to a housing line being used initially as a conduit for support. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, and I do remember my team being asked to sort of signpost people onto that line, but then I believe it was quite quickly overwhelmed.
Okay. So you were aware at an early stage that the ORBKC housing line was not coping with the volume of calls?
That's my memory, yes.
Yes. Okay. And let's touch upon another email, ORBK 000021073, which deals with the subject of the operation of the support line. It's an email from Tony Andrews on the 17th of June at 17:28. It's addressed to you, amongst other people, and Ms. Spragg. Mm-hmm. And the third line of the email under key points and actions. Tony, to reinforce message from frontline staff that helpline number needs to be published immediately. So this is on the 17th of June in the evening, late afternoon, early evening. Were you aware of any issues in relation to the publicising of the British Red Cross helpline number?
Yes, and I think that email reflects it, yes.
So there was a support line. It was set up. You said there was a delay in setting it up, and then there appears to be a delay in publicising the fact that there was a support line.
Yes, which I think reflects this confusion around, is it going to be the Red Cross, and if so, what's the number, and how do we promote that on behalf of the response team and the local authority, yes.
Were any provisions made on the British Red Cross support line for individuals who were non-English speakers?
It's always something that we try to address. We, as the Red Cross, use facilities like Language Line, for example,
Yes.
and we will use those as part of our usual capability. It's not always something that is able to put in place really quickly,
No.
depending on languages and range of languages that are needed, but we always do try to do that.
So a feature that you're alive to, but there can be difficulties in putting in place that capacity.
Yes, I think that's fair, yes.
Well, let's have a look at some records again to assist you. If we return back to the operational update document, BRC 6087, and we can fast forward to page 36. We've already seen one of these documents. This is the 21st of June 2017. And we go down to support line, and we turn over the next page, please. Thank you. So we've identified the date, and
Okay.
you see the paragraph there, support line. And it says that the amount of calls it received, support line operating from Norwich, that's in red text, so that's new. And then the bottom section, currently securing a process for providing interpreter services on a support line. The number will then be advertised in multiple languages. So the position would be on the 21st of June. It had been set up, it appears, on the 16th of June, but there was still no facility at that stage to provide support for non-English speakers. Is that correct?
It does look that way, yes.
And you mentioned it's something that you're aware of. This indicates that there was an identification of that need and there was an effort to secure that process. Let's look to the last document. We can go to page 38 of this document. Thank you. This is the 24th of June, 3 days later.
Okay.
And if we turn to page 39 of that document, we see support line right down at the bottom. So 3 days later, 24th of June, we see the entry I just read out a moment ago, currently securing a process, and then in red text indicating it's new. This has been arranged and leaflets have been translated into key languages identified. So drawing that together, support line set up on the 16th of June, it appears. Delay in setting up, delay in advertising. Then we see that 21st of June, still no ability to provide language translation for non-English speakers. And then the 24th of June is the first time there is that availability of the support line to facilitate those who don't speak English.
From the data of that report, it does suggest that's the first time. I'm not sure if there was one in an intervening period, but that's the update on that report. I think as well the other thing to say is it was quite difficult to know all the languages that were needed because that needs assessment wasn't something that was available. So we needed to make sure that the right languages were provided, but there were points at which we didn't know what they were.
Okay. There may be reasons why, but from a public-facing perspective, the difficulty was in an ethnically diverse area, if a person didn't speak English, they wouldn't be able to utilise themselves individually the support line for a number of days. Is that correct?
Yes, and it's something that we were very well aware of as a Red Cross. We were trying to address it through the support line and also having things translated into different languages at the scene and at the various rest centres as well. So yes, I think that's fair to say it was a challenge, yeah.
And in relation to the operation of the support line in English, was there issues that you were aware of in those early days as to its operation?
There were challenges around the information that was available for us to brief the support line with. Yes, that I think I've seen some evidence about as well. Sorry, I think I've seen some evidence about that as well, about some specific instances. Yeah.
And perhaps I could deal with it shortly. Is that there was emails which were sent to you on the 20th of June, indicating that they were testing the line effectively, and the experience, and it's described that the person they spoke to was warm and friendly, positive, but the negative was that they were vague in their response, and the only thing was that that person who called up was referred to the Westway, which touches upon your concern that there was that sort of lack of information to forward on. And is it right that on the 21st of June, BRC staff were then provided with a guidance pack to ensure that they had further details to deal with queries? Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's right. We were provided with basically a briefing document that was the place that pulled together all that information that was available.
Yes. And it's, again, from other documentation, it would appear that it took a few more days, at least up to the 24th of June, for those teething problems to be ironed out. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I think it is. I think it's also fair to say that it was still a very dynamic picture. There was still lots of information to be collated and pulled together in one place. So the briefing document will have been updated at various points, I can remember, in that time. So having everything in one place that was a constant picture to brief support line teams and others on was quite difficult. But yeah.
No more support line. We're going to turn to flyers/leaflets and newsletters. And you've previously mentioned that, and we've seen that there was flyers or leaflets created to advertise a support line, which we touched upon. Were you aware prior to the 16th of June whether there was any leaflets or flyers distributed in the community by the British Red Cross or any other formal agency?
I'm not aware of anything that was formal, but I could be wrong because I wasn't always there on the scene.
The information probably suggests it wasn't, but I just wondered if you had any independent recollection. We saw at your statement when we were looking at paragraph 78A that there was an improvement in relation to communication made by the Grenfell Fire Response Team when they instructed the British Red Cross to compile and produce daily newsletters to provide information to survivors and to make sure this information was distributed. In relation to newsletters, was that something later in the timeline which was created? Can you recall when that was?
Not exactly, but I do remember it was a few days after the fire itself, yes, and it was at the response team that happened.
And you say this at your statement, paragraph 78B, said that once a decision had been taken to provide information by way of newsletters, these were initially only produced in English. The BRC ensured that these letters were translated into multiple languages to try and reach as many people as possible, and at the request of the BEC supported delivery of the newsletter to a number of hotels where survivors were known to have been located. So in essence, newsletters initially in English, BRC then facilitated their translation, and then in due course there was a request that they would be delivered to hotels. Is that correct?
Yes.
That's the sort of sequencing. You can't really help us with the fine detail as to dates.
I'm really sorry, I wish I could, but I can't remember those.
Well, Ms. Spragg, I'm very grateful for your time today and the information, the hard copy information you provide us, which has allowed me to draw out those points today. With the chairman's leave, perhaps we could have a short break.
Yes. Well, Ms. Spragg, Mr. Keating thinks he's asked all the questions he needs to ask, but we always have a short break at this stage to give him a chance to check that he's not left anything out, and also to allow others who are following the proceedings but not from within the room to suggest questions that perhaps we ought to ask you. So we'll break now. Mr. Keating, if I said 12:10, would that give you enough time, do you think?
That should be ample time.
Well, we'll see how we go. If you need more time, you can indicate. We'll say that we'll break now, come back at 12:10, and then we'll see if there are any more questions for you.
Fine.
All right?
Thank you.
Thank you. Would you go with the usher, please? All right, Mr. Keating, well, we'll say 12:10. If it turns out that you need more time, just get the usher to come and tell us.
Thank you very much.
All right? Thank you. Would you ask the Spragg to come back in, please? Right, Mr. Spragg, we'll see if there are any more questions for you. Yes, Mr.
Well, thank you.
Keating?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There is a number of questions, and they can distill to three relatively brief areas. Perhaps you could assist us with, Ms. Spragg. First of all, the Westway. So we know the Westway became the Consolidated Rest Centre. The first question, did you think that the Westway was appropriate in hindsight, as the location of the Consolidated Rest Centre?
I think in terms of location, it was quite appropriate because it was near, and it was a place that people could get to, people who were directly affected. As a building, it had its challenges, but many rest centres do.
And in terms of challenges, what would you say? What are the challenges of the building?
The fact that it was a big space, particularly for a rest centre with lots of people who were needing, therefore, to be together in that space. So lots of mattresses together. So that's where it potentially wasn't ideal.
You mentioned the lack of privacy being one
Yes.
of the features. The Westway transitioned to a community assistance centre. So the next question is, in hindsight, do you consider that the Westway was appropriate as a community assistance centre or a humanitarian assistance centre?
I mean, it was big enough to house all of the different agencies that needed to come together to provide support, and big enough, well, it was of a good size to accommodate lots of people at once, so that was a positive. But again, the space itself needed some adjustments to make it appropriate in terms of division of space and things like that, and to make it more comfortable for people.
So in terms of size, accessibility, good, but it's actually utilising the space within better.
Yes.
We know that the Westway, by the evening of the 14th of June, was the official Consolidated Rest Centre. We've heard a number of other rest centres, spontaneous rest centres, remained open within the community, such as the Rugby Portobello Trust, the Clement James Centre, and they continue to be utilised by the community on the 15th, 16th of June and thereafter. Was that something that you were aware of, that members of the community were utilising other locations?
Yes, we were aware of that.
And in terms of the support the British Red Cross provided, am I right in your understanding your evidence that that support was solely focused in those early days within the Westway?
That's where when the Westway was defined as the main centre, that's where we focused our efforts, but we weren't solely there because we knew there were people in different places. So we had people operating almost in outreach roles or engagement roles, if you like, to try and build the picture of where people were. But predominantly we were focused at the Westway.
And in relation to outreach work, is it right that that took place a number of days later? It wasn't immediate?
Not immediate. I think over the weekend we had people who were going out and trying to find, going to the various hotels and places where we'd been told or we believed people were, and trying to understand their needs. But it immediately was focused on the centres.
And do you think in retrospect the British Red Cross should have perhaps provided more support on the 15th, 16th and 17th of June, as example, at those other locations such as the Rugby Portobello Trust, the Clement James Centre?
I think ideally, and it's something we've definitely learned from as an organisation, that to have people whose role it is to engage with different places in a community and talk to different community leaders and different organisations, that's something that would have been beneficial. It's not only our role to do that, and I would say that was the point at the time, that there could have been a number of organisations involved in that, and some of that information could have been known sooner, as we've discussed.
Yes.
But it's definitely something we've learned, that community engagement is something that we are investing more in that, because it's just so vital, and it was wonderful that those centres opened up and necessary that they did so. And we want to kind of be closer to that and understand it and help to connect it all together as part of a coordinated response.
And the final point, and a discrete point, which flows from the support line we're discussing and the difficulties and the delay in relation to having that facility for language support to be available on the line. You described one of the difficulties was getting information as to the different languages which may be required. Just to follow up on that, can you recall what efforts, if any, you made to try to get that information as to the languages of those who were affected?
My role in that will have been through the humanitarian assistance groups to keep flagging the issue that we would believe there's a number of languages and we need to know what they are to be able to provide the right support in those languages.
And do you have a recollection of raising that within those steering group meetings?
I don't have a specific recollection of that, I'm afraid.
Ms. Spragg, I'm very grateful for your time today. They're all the questions I have. Was there anything else that you considered was relevant to the inquiry's investigation that you wanted to raise, which I haven't covered?
No, I think you've covered everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it just remains for me to say on behalf of the inquiry team, thank you so much for attending today and providing that documentation prior to today.
And I should like to thank you as well on behalf of the panel, all three members of the panel, who've, I think, found it very interesting to hear what you have to tell us, and very useful as well. So thank you very much for coming to give your evidence, and you're now free to go.
Thank you, and thank you for everything you're doing as well. Thank you very much.
Well, now, Mr. Keating, we're going to have another witness in a moment, but there's also a change of cast amongst the council, I think.
There is, yes.
So, for the usual reasons, we'll rise for a couple of minutes while that happens.
Thank you.
And perhaps you'd ask the usher to come and find us as soon as we're ready to continue.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chairman, or good afternoon, I should say. Good afternoon, members of the panel. I now call Miss Katharine Hammond, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Ms. Hammond.
Good afternoon.
I gather you're going to affirm.
I am,
The words are there on the screen. Would you read them out, please?
certainly. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable. All right? Yes, Mr. Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Hammond, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Can I start by thanking you very much for coming to the inquiry and assisting us with our investigations? We're extremely grateful to you.
My pleasure.
A few points by way of introduction. If you could keep your voice up so that the person who sits to your right over there can get your words down very clearly on the transcript, that would be very good. Please also avoid nodding or shaking your head. You have to say yes or no, as the case may be, otherwise it doesn't come out on the transcript. I'll be asking you a number of questions. If at any point you want me to repeat the question or you don't understand it, I can either repeat it or ask it in a different way. We'll be taking breaks, apart from lunchtime today, mid-afternoon today, and during the course of tomorrow, in accordance with the usual schedule. But if you need a break at any other time, please just let us know. Now, you've made 3 statements to the inquiry, and I'm going to show them to you first. They will appear, as will all documents that we're going to look at together, on your screen. The first is dated the 5th of March 2019, and that's at CAB 30147664, please. Is that the first page of your first witness statement?
Yes, it is.
And can we please go to page 25? And you'll see above the date of the 3rd of March 2019 is a signature. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
And if we go please to your second witness statement, CAB 30147799, there's the first page bearing the date 10th July 2020. Is that the first page of your statement, second statement?
Yes.
And if we go please to page 20, you'll see a signature above the date, or next to the date. Is that your signature?
Yes, it is.
And your third statement is at CAB 30148116. That's dated the 30th of August 2020. Is that the first page of your third statement?
Yes.
And if we go please to page 35, you'll see a signature above the date. Is that your signature?
Yes.
Have you read each of these 3 statements recently?
I have, yes.
And can you confirm for us that the contents of each of these 3 statements is true?
It is.
Thank you. Now, you've also produced 96 exhibits marked KH1 to KH96, which form part of your evidence. Is that right?
Correct.
Now, I want to start, if I may please, with some background. At the time of the fire at Grenfell Tower, on the 14th of June 2017, you were, I think, Director of the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, or CCS, within the Cabinet Office. Is that right?
That's right.
How long were you in that role before June 2017?
I had joined the previous summer, August of previous year.
And I think you had, in that role, is this right, overall responsibility for CCS, and you reported to the Deputy National Security Advisor,
Correct.
Who was, I think, Paddy McGuinness at the time.
That's right, yes.
And I think his full title was Deputy National Security Advisor for Intelligence, Security and Resilience. Is that right?
That's right.
And before that, I don't think we have anything in your statement by way of a run-up. Could you give us a thumbnail sketch of your academic background and your qualifications?
So my academic background is I'm a graduate in English literature and in public policy. I spent most of my career working in and around the Home Office and the criminal justice system. And prior to joining CCS, I had worked for Sir John Chilcot on his inquiry into the Iraq War.
Now, I'm going to ask you about the policies, procedures and plans that were put in place by central government to deal with an emergency, a major emergency. And I'm going to ask first about the statutory framework. Now, to be clear, I'm not asking you to interpret it. I'm asking for your contemporaneous understanding of how it worked. Now, is it right that you understood at the time that the framework for emergency planning and response arrangements in the United Kingdom was governed, and is still governed, by the Civil Contingencies Act 2004?
That's right.
and also the subordinate legislation, the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, Contingency Planning Regulations 2005.
Correct.
Yes. And there were, I think, statutory and non-statutory sets of guidance, emergency preparedness being the statutory set, and emergency response and recovery being the non-statutory set. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's right.
And Section 1 of the Act, did you understand, introduced the concept of an emergency, including an event or situation which threatens serious damage to human welfare in a place in the UK, yes?
Yes.
And is it right that the Grenfell Tower fire satisfied that definition?
Yes.
Now, Part 1 of the Act, I think, also focuses on local arrangements for civil protection and establishes a statutory framework of roles and responsibilities for what are designated as Category 1 and Category 2 responders. Is that correct?
That's right, yes.
And that's how you understood it at the time?
Yes.
Now, can I ask you to look, please, at Section 5.1 of the Act? And we find that at CAB 404616, page 7. We'll have page 1 to start with, so we can be sure we're looking at the right thing. There it is. There's the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. And you can see on the first page under Section 1, meaning of emergency, and the definition is there as I put to you. Now, if we go, please, to page 7, you can see a heading, Civil Protection, Section 5, General Measures. And it says this, under subsection 1, a Minister of the Crown may by order require a person or body listed in Part 1 of Schedule 1 to perform a function of that person or body for the purpose of A, preventing the occurrence of an emergency, B, reducing, controlling or mitigating the effects of an emergency, or C, taking other action in connection with an emergency. What was your understanding of the powers available to ministers under that section in general terms at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
I think that is the section of the legislation that gives ministers power, which is given effect through the regulations to designate Category 1 and 2 responders.
And if we go to page 9, you can see under General, Section 7, Urgency. This section applies where there is an urgent need to make provision of a kind that could be made by an order under Section 5, subsection 1, or by regulations under Section 6, subsection 1, but there is insufficient time for the order or regulations to be made. Did you have an understanding of, or were you conscious of that power at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
I was familiar with the Act, yes.
Right. My question is, first, was any consideration given during the days after the fire in which you were involved, so far as you know, to invoking or exercising the powers I've just shown you, both under Section 5.1 or under Section 7?
I don't recall any consideration of invoking powers under Section 7. Section 5, I think, refers to the regulations which were already in existence.
Right. So just to be clear and to go back to page 7, please, subsection 1 of Section 5, is it the case as a fact that no consideration was given by any minister during the days after the fire to making an order under that subsection?
Not that I recollect, no.
Was the topic raised at all, to the best of your recollection?
Not to the best of my recollection.
Right. Now, it's also right to think that Part 2 of the Act makes provision for emergency powers, for example, specific legislative measures that might be necessary to deal with the effects of the most extreme emergencies. Am I right in thinking that, as a fact, those powers were not used in relation to the Grenfell Tower fire?
That's correct.
Yes. It's also right, I think, and just confirm for us, if you would, that the Cabinet Office and other government departments are not responders for the purposes of the Act.
That's correct.
Yes. Now, I want to ask you next about the Cabinet Office and its role in the broader policy framework. First, is it right that the Cabinet Office is responsible for formulating the policy framework within which emergency response arrangements in England and Wales are delivered?
That's correct. The Cabinet Office is responsible for the Civil Contingencies Act and for the regulations and a number of pieces of the guidance that sit beneath it, although not all.
And within the Cabinet Office, is it right that the Civil Contingencies Secretariat, the CCS, leads the work on emergency response and resilience?
That's correct, particularly in relation to civil emergencies. There are other responsibilities in relation to different kinds of risks, particularly threat-based risks.
Yes, and just drawing that out a little further, could we please go to your first statement, page 9, paragraph 29. And there you say in the last sentence, CCS is primarily a coordinating body in the planning, response and recovery phases and has no direct operational role in the local response to an emergency. That's right, is it? You can confirm that?
That's correct.
Yes. And I think it's right also that the CCS itself is responsible for the guidance which accompanies the 2004 Act, including emergency preparedness and emergency response and recovery.
That's correct.
Now, we'll come back to those guidance documents later. If you go, please, to page 6 of your statement, paragraph 21, you say, having confirmed the point that I've just put to you, in the second sentence, it does not, however, have an inspectorate role. That is, it is not the role of CCS to make sure that local responders fulfil their duties under the Act. And then you continue in the same paragraph, and you say, CCS, this is in the last sentence, CCS has also developed resilience standards and is piloting an approach which allows LRFs to assess themselves against them. Now, given that the CCS does not have an inspectorate role, can you just explain what is meant when you say a non-statutory assurance role?
It means a role working in support of local responders to help them understand their own level of preparedness, particularly through the Resilience Capabilities Survey, which I think is also described in my statement, and some work subsequent to the Grenfell Tower fire to enhance that, particularly through the creation of resilience standards against which local areas can assess themselves.
Right. So you do refer to it in your statement. Let's go to page 6, please, paragraph. Well, we're in the paragraph itself. You say we draw together a picture of the level of resilience capabilities in place across England and Wales through the Resilience Capabilities Survey. I'll come back to that if I need to in due course. Mm-hmm. But turning to the role of DCLG, if we go, please, to page 7 of your statement, paragraph 25, you say this. As explained above at paragraph 21, responsibility for oversight of the local response capability is shared between CCS and the DCLG Resilience and Emergencies Division, DCLG RED, with CCS leading on policy development and RED on LRF engagement. DCLG RED's role is to interact directly with LRFs and provide central government representation at LRF meetings during the planning phase and staff the government liaison officer role during emergencies to provide ministers, government departments of the local area with situational awareness, act as a critical friend, and to help identify and resolve any issues outstanding. Now, assuming that's correct, and focusing particularly on where you say shared between CCS and the DCLG Resilience and Emergencies Division, RED, before the fire in June 2017, did you yourself ever experience any problems or hear of any problems arising from that division of responsibilities between CCS on the one hand and DCLG RED on the other for overseeing local response capability?
Not to my recollection. I think it's a fairly clear division of responsibilities and teams that worked very closely together to resolve any shared issues.
If we go to page 10 of your statement then, paragraph 32, you provide an overview, I think, there of the role of the CCS. And give us 5 instances there of the basic role. And then in paragraph 33, you say the CCS's work is focused on 3 key areas: risk assessment, 1, 2, preparation and planning, including building capability and training, and 3, response and recovery. Now, I'm going to examine each of those topics in detail with you. Mm-hmm. And I want first, please, then, to turn to risk assessment. Is it right that the CCS as part of this role, is responsible for producing a national risk assessment, or NRA.
That's correct.
Yes. And that happens once every 2 years, does it?
Correct.
Did at the time of the fire?
That's right.
Yes. Now, is it right that the deputy director was Paul McLauchry under your leadership at the time of the fire?
That's correct.
And I think is this right? He was responsible for national risks and infrastructure, which would include producing the NRA, yes?
That's right.
And if we look at his statement, please, CAB 30014798, and go, please, to page 3, paragraph 11. Paul McLauchry says, the NRA is a classified document. It identifies what the government considers to be the most serious types of risks facing the United Kingdom over the next 5 years. In order for a risk to be included in the NRA, it must constitute a civil emergency within the meaning of the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, the 2004 Act, be an event that could plausibly happen within the next 5 years, and exceed a minimum impact threshold. There are usually between 70 and 100 risks detailed in the NRA. Now, assuming that, well, first of all, do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yes. Now, on that basis, is it right that the NRA informs capability development and provides a basis for allocating resources to particular capabilities?
That's right. Both the risk assessment and the set of planning assumptions generated from it, and they're an important second part of the picture, are used to inform capability development.
Can I ask you, please, to keep your voice up a little bit?
Of course, sorry.
That's right. They inform capability development, and does that in turn inform the allocation of resources to particular capabilities?
It's certainly part of the evidence base which is used to do that, yes.
Yes. Now, is this right? The most recent edition of the National Risk Assessment, NRA, before the Grenfell Tower fire was the 2016 NRA. Is that right?
That's right.
And I think that was released in the February of 2017. Yes.
Correct.
Yes. Now, if we turn back to your statement, please, your second statement this time, page 2, paragraph 6. You say, and it's at the foot of your screen, the 2016 NRA provided information that departments, agencies and local planners stroke responders could use to determine, 1, the scale, duration and severity of the consequences of emergencies, which can be used to inform generic planning and capability building, and 2, risks which may merit additional specific planning and or capability building to supplement those generic plans and capabilities. So is it right that the NRA is the basis from which resilience forums should develop their own local risk assessments adapted to local circumstances?
Yes, the NRA and the planning assumptions, I think, also play into that process.
Right. And in relation to the preparation of the 2016 NRA, is it right, and I think you confirmed this, let's go to paragraph 10 where we see this on page 4. If we go to the top of page 4, you say, for each risk within the 2016 NRA, there was a designated risk owner. The designated risk owner was a government department or agency. Designated risk owners have a range of responsibilities for the risks that they own. And is it right that the designated risk owner was fixed as a particular government department or agency in each NRA?
Yes, that's right. Usually the department or agency with the greatest expertise in relation to that particular risk.
Right. So for fire, was the risk owner the DCLG until it moved to the Home Office?
As those responsibilities moved between departments, yes, the ownership would have moved with it. So in 2017, it was with the Home Office.
Right. And did that involve a move of staff within one department familiar with contingency planning in respect of the risks owned by that department to another department?
My recollection, and apologies, this is some years ago, is that the teams responsible for policy in relation to fire moved between the two departments. So moved from DCLG to the Home Office.
I see. And you say responsible for policy. Did that include policy and planning for civil contingencies as part of the NRA exercise?
It would include ownership of that risk in the NRA, yes.
Thank you. Now let's then go back to Paul McLauchry's first statement, CAB 30144798, this time page 4, paragraph 13. He says here, the relevant department for each risk is responsible for collecting evidence to inform the risk assessment process. That may have been done internally or by consulting external experts, either in other departments or in academia/industry. And then he goes on, the relevant department is then required to use that evidence to identify for each risk type the reasonable worst case scenario, RWC, the likelihood of the RWC occurring, and the potential impact if it does. Is that right? Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Now, the RWC is the reasonable worst case scenario. Does that mean, just expanding it, the worst outcome in terms of disruption, casualties, and other relevant factors that can reasonably be expected to occur if the risk transpires?
I think the way we usually describe it is a plausible but challenging manifestation of the risk. So not the absolute worst version, but something which would be extremely difficult, but is also reasonably likely within the next 5 years.
And what is the yardstick or objective standard for reasonably?
In relation to reasonable worst case scenario?
Yes.
So there is a plausibility yardstick which is used in the risk assessment, but there's an awful lot of professional judgment and expertise which is used in creating these scenarios and then making a judgment about which one is the reasonable worst case.
And does worst case encompass the nature of the risk, but does it also encompass scale of outcome?
Yes, it relates to the impacts of the risk should it occur.
Right, but in addressing the reasonableness of the worst case scenario, are those impacts focused on kinds of impacts, categories of outcomes, if you like, or are they focused on the scale of outcomes in each category identified as reasonable?
Both.
Both. Then I think you say, well, McLauchry says, if we can just pick this up at page 10 in his statement, please, paragraph 36. This is under the heading Assessments of Fire Risk Prior to Grenfell Tower Fire. The 2016 NRA did include a significant fire as one of its risk types, but the specific scenario considered to be the reasonable worst-case fire was a rural wildfire rather than an urban or tower block fire. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes. And he says that is not to say that an urban fire was not considered as part of the process of preparing the NRA, but rather that such a fire was not considered to be the reasonable worst-case scenario. And then over the page, the assessment, we go over the page, the assessment of the relevant department, Home Office, was that a wildfire was the risk that was likely to lead to the most severe consequences. Based on the information available at that time, the assessment was that an urban fire was unlikely to lead to the level of casualties and fatalities that sadly resulted from the Grenfell Tower fire. Now, it's right, I think, isn't it, that there was no mention of an urban or tower block fire within the 2016 NRA?
There was no distinct risk labelled as a tower block fire, but some of the consequences of such a fire were captured in the scenarios of other risks.
Some of the consequences?
All of the consequences, actually, I think.
Did the Home Office, as the owner of the risk at the time, or the CCS, perform any actual analysis of an urban or tower block fire to lead it, or you, perhaps, to consider that such a fire was not a reasonable worst-case scenario?
I'm afraid I can't give you evidence on the analysis performed by the Home Office at the time. I don't think we have been able to find specific evidence of that in the CCS files, to my recollection.
Yes. I mean, my question was whether it was considered and discounted or whether it wasn't considered at all. Can you help?
I would have to go away and look again at the paperwork. It's not to my recollection.
can you not have one or more than one kind of fire which would meet the reasonable worst case scenario?
That is possible, but there is a strong incentive to make the NRA a usable document. So, as Mr. McLaughley's statement says, that there are between 70 and 100 risks already on the risk assessment. So there's always a consideration where if the impacts of a risk are already captured in other scenarios, we would try to keep the overall set number of scenarios at a manageable level for local responders.
Right. So if somebody, maybe you, maybe not you, perhaps you can help, was asked, well, where do I find a risk assessment which covers the outcomes of an urban fire or a tower block fire, a tall residential building in a densely populated area, urban area? Where do I find it? Is it right that the people who compile the NRA would not point to the wildfire risk, but would point to another kind of risk and say the outcomes are all captured there? Is that how it worked? So
with the benefit of hindsight, when we did add a tower block risk to the fire, to the NRA, forgive me, it did not move the planning assumptions that it generated because we found that the impact of that fire had already been captured. So if you are a local responder, perhaps, thinking about your own planning needs and used the planning assumptions in the NRA, you would have covered those impacts. In relation to a specific description of a tower block fire, that may have appeared on local risk registers across the country, but it didn't appear in the NRA.
We'll come to look at this in due course, but in light of that answer, would there be a problem in ownership of the risk? By which I mean this: if the outcomes of the Grenfell Tower fire would not be found under any fire-related risk, but found under a different kind of risk for which another government department had responsibility, then who would own which government department would own the risk or knew it owned the risk?
So the Home Office would continue to own the assessment of the risk. For most risks in the NRA, responding to them engages capabilities for which responsibility is spread across a number of departments. So the ownership of the overall risk would not affect the deployment of the capabilities needed.
Let me see if I can understand that. Supposing, and it may or may not be the case, that when those compiling the NRA considered that all the risks making up the reasonable worst case scenario, the RWC, reasonable worst case, for an incident like Grenfell Tower were not to be found in the wildfires section for obvious reasons, but could be found under, let's assume, structural collapse of a tall building.
Yep.
The ownership of that risk would not rest with the Home Office, would it? It would rest with, presumably, DCLG.
I think that's correct, but I'd have to check. But the capabilities you would deploy to deal with that, you would nonetheless expect to be in place because of the existence of that risk.
Right. Was there a system whereby each government department would know that when it owned a risk, it might be looking at a cause which didn't necessarily always fit within its ownership? For example, the DCLG might have to deal with a structural building collapse, but the Home Office would also have to deal with the same reasonable worst case when considering a tower block fire.
So the process of creating the risk assessment is a cross-government one, led by CCS, but with all departments with relevant responsibilities involved. And I think it is described in either my statement or Mr. McLaughley's statement, the layers of scrutiny and clearance that the risk assessment goes through. So there should be good visibility of both the risks and their consequences as set out in the planning assumptions.
Let's continue with Mr. McLaughley's statement, please. Page 4. We go back to paragraph 14. He says, "My team conducts a policy and assurance role in relation to the RWC's return from other department. We ask awkward questions and critically challenge their assessments. Do you remember whether any concerns were raised by the CCS about the absence of a significant urban fire in the 2016 NRA, or the process of compiling it?
Not to my knowledge.
And I think you say, if we go to your second statement, page 18, paragraph 59, your second statement, at CAB 30147799, page 18. Paragraph 59. As to whether there was any concerns on the part of CCS about the absence of a significant urban fire, including a tower block fire, in the 2016 NRA, I would again be surprised had issue been taken with that. As I've explained above, most, if not all, of the outcomes that would arise in relation to such a risk have been generated by other RWCs and had been incorporated into the 2016 NRAs as a result. NRPAs, you think, as a result. The PAs there is planning assumptions, is it?
Correct.
Right. That being so, you go on, the omission from the 2016 NRA of an urban fire RWCS, reasonable worst case scenario, would not have given rise to any obvious gaps in the risk assessment and response framework. In those circumstances, there would have been no basis to take issue with the Home Office's assessment as to the need to include an urban fire risk in the NRA, and to the best of my knowledge, CCS did not do so. Now, do you know for a fact, just circling back to the point, whether actually the exercise had been done consciously, that there was no need to include an urban fire or tower block fire as a specific risk because the outcomes which needed to be planned for had been catered for under other risks?
So I think in the paragraph below the one you just referred to, it does say we've not been able to find evidence in the documents of that consideration taking place. So I don't think I can assist further than that, unfortunately.
Right, but do I understand your evidence from before that it would have been normal to do so? It would be normal to consider that and discount it because it was covered by another risk.
So yes, it would. And the way the process of compiling the risk assessment works is that often we would start with a much larger number of scenarios and they would be reduced to a core which formed the risk assessment. So it would be perfectly possible that consideration took place. We just don't have evidence for it, I'm afraid.
Can you help me with this? I get the impression from what you've just been describing that actually what you're concentrating on is outcomes rather than events. Is that fair? Or what you should be concentrating on is outcomes rather than events.
Yes, so this is a very capability-led approach, which means the planning assumptions are a really crucial tool.
Yeah.
With the theory being, if you plan to be ready to deal with all of the consequences set out in the planning assumptions, in whatever configuration they appear, and from whatever cause, you should be in a good position to deal with them.
I mean, it strikes me that the urban tower block fire, the large building collapse, and just to suggest another potential risk, an aircraft crash into a tall building, would all generate very similar outcomes, effects, if you like. But the system seems to start with the event and then look at the outcomes rather than seeking to stand back and say, now, what are we likely to have to deal with for one or other or any unforeseen reason?
I think the system is intended to do both, which is why we have both the risk assessment and the planning assumptions, because the nature of the risk obviously gives you some indications as to which consequences may occur together, which obviously you would want to think about in planning a response.
All right, thank you. Yes.
Now, if we go to your second statement, please, at page 19, let's look together at paragraph 63. You say there, it's not feasible for the NRA or any document to describe all possible risk scenarios. Local responders are expected to adapt the assumptions made in the NRA and NRPA to their local areas and particular context. Clearly, a local resilience forum based in a rural area will be more likely to face a wildfire than one based in a city centre. Now, was it the case, or did you understand it to be the case, that the omission of an urban fire reasonable worst-case scenario in the 2016 NRA affected the ability of Category 1 and Category 2 responders to make a fully informed local risk assessment?
I think the presence of the consequences in the planning assumptions should have meant it did not have that effect.
But would that not mean, or would that not require, those responsible for contingency planning in local areas would have to operate on the same basis as the CCS, namely that when looking at the risks, which are events rather than outcomes, they would have to understand that there may be other events which cover the same outcomes?
Yes, and I would expect in compiling local risk registers, and have seen examples of this, that a good degree of local judgment is applied to what might be the most plausible manifestation in that particular geographic area. So that expertise, that judgment is important.
Right. Well, the expertise and judgment is important, but what is it specifically that a local resilience forum responsible for compiling the local risk register apt for its area would look at to know that it shouldn't simply look at the register and work from that, but actually would need to look into the individual risks in the register and search for outcomes to make sure that they were covered?
Well, two things, I think. Firstly, the planning assumptions, which, as I said, are a really key part of this process. And then secondly, the guidance referred to in here, which sets out how to go about using a product which is national and making it of best utility for your local area.
Now, in your second statement again, we can go back to page 5, please, paragraph 14. You say the latest version of the NRA could be amended or updated if there was a justification for doing so. A designated risk owner could propose a new risk or an amendment to an existing risk on the basis of new evidence emerging since the last NRA review cycle. New evidence could include 1. Lessons from UK or international emergencies or exercises. 2. New research, analysis and or data. 3. A change in circumstance which potentially affects the UK's vulnerability to the risk, an attacker's capability, intent, etc. So is it right that, well, perhaps you can explain. I mean, it's the case, I think, that even following the Lakenhall House fire in July 2009, the Shirley Towers fire in Southampton in 2010, or the Adair Tower fire in October 2015 within RBKC itself, no consideration was given centrally by the CCS to whether an urban tower block fire should be included in the NRA.
It's correct that one was not added to the NRA. I think, as I alluded to before, I'm afraid we couldn't find evidence of consideration of it, so I can't be definitive to say that consideration didn't happen.
Right, but if, on the assumption that no consideration was given to the inclusion of an urban tower block fire after those events, which would lead to lessons from the UK, new research, analysis or data, can you explain why no consideration was given to including an urban tower block fire as a specific risk?
I think in the absence of evidence of consideration or otherwise, I can't really assist on that point. That discussion may have taken place, but we just could not find evidence for it.
Now,
well, is it not likely that if there'd been a serious consideration of it, there would be some evidence of it?
I think it depends what form that consideration took. It could have been a lengthy conversation, or it could have been on paper. I'm afraid I'm in some difficulty at diagnosing things I don't have evidence for.
Well, what I was suggesting was that the absence of evidence might lead to an inference.
I think one might infer that, but I can't be definitive, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, it's just gone 1 o'clock. I've really got two main questions to cover before I get to a new section.
Well, go on then, Mr. Bennett.
Well, may I? I mean, yes, we've only been going. Yes. Can we stick with the second statement, please, and go to page 18 next? And at paragraph 61, you say, in the foot of the screen, it is important to acknowledge that the impacts described in the wildfire RWCS were at a level broadly equivalent to, almost more severe than, the impacts experienced in the Lakanal House fire, and were therefore appropriate for contingency planning and capability building purposes. Was that a view, do you know, consciously adopted by the Home Office at the time and the CCS at the time, that the 2016 NRA was compiled?
So I think, again, this is I'm in the same difficulty as with your last question, that I don't have evidence of that consideration or that view being taken.
Right, so this is your opinion about appropriateness rather than your statement that it was considered appropriate?
This is an analysis of the document and the impacts as they stood. So it's certainly a plausible rationale, but I'm afraid I don't have the documents which describe it.
Now, in terms of outcomes, whether it's a tower block fire or whether it's a building collapse, structural collapse, or whether it's an aircraft flying into a tall building, different risks, do you know whether anybody ever performed a comparison of the differences in the types of community that displaced by these different incidents?
I think it's unlikely we would have done that at a national level. It's the sort of consideration I would expect to happen in relation to local risk assessment.
Now, it's right to think, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, Ms. Hammond, but Robert McFarlane was another deputy director under your leadership at the time of the fire.
Correct.
Yes. And he was responsible, was he, for UK resilience training, doctrine and standards within the CCS?
Correct.
Let's look at his statement, please. It's at CAB 3014794, page 10. I just want to look at paragraph 35 with you. And he says, my team also works in partnership with the JESIP team on Joint Organisational Learning, or JOL. This is a system for recording and disseminating lessons learned. The core part of the project is an online database, JOL Online, which acts as a single repository for the capture and collation of multi-agency lessons arising from incident, training, testing, and other external sources. Inputs into the system are obtained from a variety of sources, including reports from responder agencies, recommendations from public inquiries, prevention of future death reports, and health and safety executive recommendations. And in his second statement, which I don't think we need to go to, he says, at the time of the Grenfell Tower fire, no lessons learned from incidents such as the Lakanal House or Trellick Tower fires had been recorded on JOL. Now, can you explain why that would be the case?
With some difficulty, I think. I mean, my assumption would be that no lesson had been distilled and recorded on that system by local responders. That is not to say that those lessons hadn't been learned and disseminated through other means, but it's difficult for me to explain otherwise, I think, why they had not chosen to do so.
No. And would you accept that the absence of previous incidents such as Lakanal or Adair from the JOL system would suggest that urban fires as a risk category was simply not on CCS's radar at all?
I think it's evidence that they were not on the JOL system. Obviously, wider consideration of fire certainly did take place as part of the NRA process. I don't think I can say much further than that.
But the absence from the JOL system would not indicate that they had been considered but consciously rejected as relevant material.
No, I think that is only one of a very wide range of sources that would be used in the compilation of the risk assessment. So its absence there is not definitive, I think.
Do you know whether that incident, Lakanal, and other later fires and the Grenfell Tower fire were added later to the JOL system?
I don't, I'm afraid, but very happy to go and ask that question and come back to you.
Mr. Chairman, is that a convenient moment?
I think it is, Mr. Millett. We've slightly overrun, but no matter. We're going to break now so we can all get some lunch, Ms. Hammond. We'll resume, please, at 2:05. And I have to ask you, as everybody else, while you're out of the room, please don't discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone.
Of course.
All right? Thank you very much. Would you go with the usher, please? Thank you. Thank you. 2:05.
Thank you.